Hey guys, tonight I want to invite you on a journey that is both strange and terrifying. The life of those called court jesters in the Middle Ages. At first glance it might sound fun, right? The jingling hats, the jokes echoing through the great hall, the acrobatics under flickering candlelight. But the reality was far different. Just one wrong word, just one failed joke, and you could go from entertainer to prisoner in the dungeon. It was a job you never chose. It chose you. Like being pointed out in a crowd and hearing the words, "That one's funny, keep him." And from that moment on, your life was as good as over. No longer a simple peasant, but a permanent plaything in the hands of the powerful. So, before we dive deeper into the darkness behind those laughs, make sure to hit like and subscribe, but only if you feel it's worth it. That not only helps the channel grow, but also tells me there are people like you, viewers who want to hear history through a different lens, where laughter always comes with danger. And don't forget to drop a comment below to let me know. Where are you watching from? And what time is it where you are right now? It's always amazing to see viewers from all around the world gathering here, in this small space, to listen to long stories, funny yet haunting, from the past. Now then, turn off the lights, lie back comfortably, and let me take you into a world where a single laugh could decide life or death. A character that seems to exist only in fairy tales or illustrations, the medieval court jester. When we think of them, we often picture a man in patched clothes, wearing a jingling cap, flailing wildly and laughing shrilly. But if you sit down and truly listen to the story, you'll see that behind those bright colours lies a life of darkness, tragedy, and misery. First of all, you need to understand one thing. No one chooses to become a jester. It's not like being a blacksmith, a carpenter, or even a soldier, jobs you could learn, train for, and willingly pursue. Court jesters were often chosen by chance, almost forced into it. Sometimes just one silly act that made nobles laugh at a feast was enough for you to be dragged from your shabby tent the next day and shoved into the castle with a jingling cap on your head. Sometimes a wealthy lord would buy you, like buying an exotic bird or a trained hunting dog, and from that moment your life belonged to them. It sounds tempting, living in a castle, eating with nobles, having a stable place to stay, but reality was far different. A jester was never part of the nobility. You were only entertainment, a living toy brought out any time, in any situation. You slept in a small storage room next to the kitchen, ate leftovers after the dogs and guards. You had no right to refuse, no right to say, "I'm tired today." Your title was like a velvet shackle, colourful on the outside, but strangling your life. The greatest pressure of being a jester was that you always had to be funny. No end of shift, no days off. You had to bring laughter in any circumstance. When the king just lost a battle, when nobles mourned a loved one, even when you yourself were sick or in grief. A single frown from the emperor could make you the scapegoat if the mood wasn't lightened in time. Just one joke at the wrong moment, one performance that failed, you could be beaten, jailed, even beheaded. Imagine, in a candlelit hall, dozens of noble eyes watching. You just made a sharp quip about the bishop. The room bursts into laughter. But then he walks in. The laughter dies instantly. No one dares look at you, and with just one grimace, you're now guilty of blasphemy. The line between funny and deadly sin was thinner than a hair, and you had to walk it every day, like a tightrope walker over a chasm. The greatest tragedy of a court jester was that no one saw them as human. You might be a brilliant musician, a sharp poet, a master actor, but all people remembered was, "That jester fell down so funny," or "He mimicked the duke's voice so well." Talent was dismissed as childish tricks. Intelligence was trampled on. And if you tried to perform too well, surpassing the nobles, that was a crime, because no one wanted to be outshone by a fool. Even at lavish banquets, with roasted meat fragrant and wine flowing, you, the one who made the whole hall laugh, might only be thrown a bone. When everyone applauded a lady's song, if you sang better, the room would fall coldly silent. Your existence was deliberately kept low, never allowed to become a threat. And then, there was another tragedy. Loneliness. You lived in the court, heard every scheme, knew every secret, but no one truly saw you as a friend. Nobles treated you like a pet, Servants saw you as a snitch who might report to the king. You had no allies, no family, no one to trust. You existed like a ghost, allowed only to make sound through laughter. A jester's life ended quietly. No gravestone carved with a name, no songs of remembrance. Maybe your body was buried at the edge of the forest, or simply disappeared when a new jester was brought in. A few scattered bells left in an old drawer were your only legacy. So why do we still remember them? Because in their staggering gait, in their seemingly harmless jokes, court jesters did something bold. They spoke the truth. When the whole court stayed silent before tyranny, the jester could mock. The rooster crows too loudly in the morning, surely it fears losing its throne. Laughter would break out, but everyone understood the hidden meaning. That's why jesters were both entertainment and a mirror of power. And that's also why they were dangerous, to themselves and to the system they served. The life of a medieval court jester, from the outside, looked like an endless chain of jokes. But if you looked closely, it was like a life sentence, where each joke was both a lifeline and a blade to the throat. They lived in the laughter of others and died in the silence of themselves. When talking about court jesters, many people often think this was a profession that existed from very early on, trained formally like soldiers, monks, or artists. But the truth was the exact opposite. There were no schools to train jesters, no books on how to become an entertainer. This profession appeared chaotically, randomly, and sometimes so cruelly that it makes one shudder. In medieval society, everyone was born into a fixed role. Peasants farmed, blacksmiths hammered iron, nobles ruled, monks prayed, but jesters didn't fit into any category. They often entered this profession simply because they were different. You might be pulled out of a crowd because you had a hunchback, a limp, a squeaky voice, or simply because you dared to say something that made an entire feast burst into laughter. And so, from one random moment, you became the official entertainer of an entire court. There are stories recorded of a peasant at a festival who, after tumbling into a mud pit and making his lord laugh uncontrollably, never returned home the next day. Instead, he was shoved into the castle, handed patched colourful clothes and a bell cap. From a poor free man, he became the noble's living property. Lucky? In reality, it was the beginning of a life chained by laughter. Beyond these accidental cases, there were jesters who were bought, sold, and exchanged as diplomatic gifts. Wealthy lords loved to collect oddities, just like they kept rare birds or bought strange statues from distant lands. A jester with a sharp tongue or a bizarre appearance could be sent from one court to another as a gift for entertainment. No one cared about his feelings, because in the eyes of the powerful, he wasn't human but a decorative object that could laugh and talk. Sometimes, the profession of jester originated from wandering performers, those who travelled fairs with magic tricks, dancing, and music. A few caught the eye of nobles and were invited to the court for regular performances. But once inside, they rarely had the chance to leave. From that moment, they became the property of the court, fed, sheltered, but stripped of freedom. No longer free-roaming artists, but the personal fools of powerful masters. Ultimately, the origins of jesters reflect a brutal truth of the Middle Ages. Society didn't know what to do with those who were different, so it turned that difference into entertainment. A hunchback, instead of being completely shunned, might be kept in the court as a laughingstock. A clever, witty man without noble lineage might be kept to juggle words of mockery. In this way, being a jester was both a chance to survive, for those without a place in society, and a curse that bound their life to a jingling bell cap. The irony was that jesters never chose that path. You didn't apply for the job, you were chosen, and that choice usually came in an instant, like a sudden sentence handed down. Today you were a peasant, tomorrow you were a fool. Today you were free, tomorrow you were a hired laugh for life. But why did courts need jesters so badly? The answer lay in the tense atmosphere of medieval courts. It was a place full of plots, suspicion, hatred, and political scheming. In that suffocating space, laughter became a kind of painkiller. And jesters were the living medicine, kept by the court to ease heaviness, to soothe a king's rage, to fill the deadly silence of endless banquets. You could say jesters appeared as a byproduct of power. When those on the throne needed someone to vent their fatigue on, someone to mock without fear of revenge, the jester was the perfect solution. You laughed with them, they laughed at you. And thus social order was preserved. The powerful remained majestic, the fool remained lowly, but both coexisted on the same chessboard. The origins of jesters, looked at closely, were a mirror of medieval society, a society willing to turn pain, difference, and even talent into tools for the amusement of the powerful few. Behind the roaring laughter in candlelit halls, we glimpse the shadows of injustice, loneliness, and despair hidden beneath the jingling bells. The profession that no one chose only got chosen. But the story doesn't end there, because once you were designated a jester, you were no longer a free human being. In the eyes of the nobility, you became a kind of property, a display piece, almost like an exotic pet. Harsh as it sounds, it's true. Picture a wealthy 14th century lord. In his castle, alongside war horses, hunting falcons, hounds chasing rabbits, there was a special collection. Human beings kept only to entertain. A hunchback jester who could dance in strange ways. A dwarf with a squeaky voice who could mock. Even women jesters kept to sing and be ridiculed, each one like a rare item, paraded at banquets as proof of their master's wealth. In the Middle Ages, nobles loved collecting rare things, from exotic animals like monkeys, parrots, leopards, to strange objects from the East. And jesters fell into that same category. An unusual appearance, a birth defect, or an odd talent could turn you into a commodity exchanged between courts. Records tell that when a lord wanted to please an ally, he wouldn't just gift horses or fine wine, but would gift his jester as well. Imagine being wrapped up like a present and sent from one castle to another, no different from a crystal vase or a prized hunting dog. And the painful part was, you had no right to refuse. In their eyes, you weren't a person, you were property. That, collecting, also led to a terrifying habit. Nobles competed with each other through jesters. A duke had a jester who could play the lute. Then, the count must find one who could juggle knives. A king owned a clever jester who used metaphors to mock politics. Then another prince wanted one too, to show off at his feasts. At banquets, jesters became living ornaments, dragged out to perform as proof of their master's power and wealth. This created a paradox. Jesters were both valued and despised. Valued because their presence brought prestige to their masters. Despised because they themselves had no worth beyond amusement. That value wasn't for the person they were, but for what they represented, evidence of someone else's authority. Picture this scene. A winter banquet, fire roaring in the hearth, wine overflowing. In the hall, a jester is dragged out, forced to dance, tell stories, mimic voices. Guests roar with laughter, slam the tables and praise. Oh, the Duke is so refined, so wealthy. Even his fool is this entertaining. The praise was never for the jester. It was for the one who owned him. The tragedy here was, you became an object to prove power. Like a jeweled sword, a rare bird from afar, or a glittering golden cup, you were displayed only to elevate someone else's status. But unlike the sword or the bird, you were human. You had feelings, pain, humiliation. Yet no one cared. Some nobles even treated jesters as rarities to flaunt through cruelty. Records from Europe tell of lords forcing jesters into bizarre costumes, or making them perform dangerous stunts, just to prove they had the power to make others do anything. For them, collecting jesters wasn't just entertainment, it was a declaration of absolute dominance. Sometimes jesters were even exchanged as diplomatic pawns. A king gifting a jester to an ally was a reminder, I'm so wealthy I can give away even my entertainer. A noble sending a jester as a wedding gift for a princess, as if to say, here, besides horses and gold, I send you a fool so your wedding feast won't be dull. And so, once again, the jester was passed from hand to hand, no different from a talking parrot or a chained bear. Look closely, and you'll see. The collecting of jesters was one of the clearest signs of the inhumanity of the feudal Middle Ages. A society so stratified that people could be lowered to the level of pets, treated as goods to be bought, sold, and traded. The laughter of jesters, therefore, was never voluntary. It was forced laughter, ringing out to cover shame. And once you had become that exotic pet in such a collection, your only path was to accept the role. You were no longer yourself. You were property pulled out to be shown off, like a rare painting or a treasure. But the most painful thing was, unlike paintings, unlike jewels, you still had a heart beating in your chest, and you knew clearly you were living a life imprisoned in the laughter of others. Court jesters were treated like exotic pets, shown off at banquets and traded like gifts. But there was an even harsher truth. Once you stepped into that role, you no longer belonged to yourself. Your life became like a lifelong house arrest. Picture this. Early morning in the castle. Chapel bells ring. Nobles rise in their velvet and silk chambers. And you, the one wearing the jingling cap, are woken by urgent knocking. Fool, get up. My lord wants a joke while shaving. You spring up from a dark corner room, usually an old storage space for brooms and barrels. You have no right to choose your sleep, no days off. You live in the palace, but no different from a prisoner chained by laughter. Don't forget, in medieval society, those without land, without a trade, without a clear status, were often seen as vagrants, easily jailed or punished. And jesters were a special category, sealed off. You weren't allowed to go anywhere alone. You couldn't leave the castle to return to your village. If you disappeared, it was considered escape, like a serf abandoning the fields or a soldier deserting the army. You were locked into the court, not by iron chains, but by the invisible bond of status. The cruelty was that confinement didn't mean safety. On the contrary, it kept you in constant tension. Inside the castle, you could be summoned any time. In the middle of a feast, in the dead of night, even when the king lost his temper over a chess game. A guard would pound on your door. Come out, perform now. My lord is furious. You weren't allowed to refuse. If you were sick, you laughed. If you were grieving, you danced. If you stayed silent too long, they suspected you were no longer useful. The outside world, fields, villages, markets, became alien. Peasants at least could go to markets, gather at festivals. You could not. Your life was confined to stone walls. You saw sunlight through high windows but couldn't step into the streets like a normal person. You heard the bustle of distant markets but never joined it. You were an insider of the court, but you belonged neither to the court nor to the outside world. Some might say, at least jesters lived in castles, had shelter, didn't toil in fields. Sounds true. But in reality, it was imprisonment, wrapped in velvet. You could stand near kings, but you weren't noble. You could eat leftovers after feasts, but never sit at the table. You lived beside power, but always on the margins, like a shadow never acknowledged. And the tragedy was, you couldn't quit. A peasant could leave his village, seek new land. A mercenary tired of war could desert and flee elsewhere. But jesters had no escape. You had no skills to survive outside the court, no land to farm, no trade to live on. Even if you wandered away, no one would see you as a former court jester. They'd see a strangely dressed man muttering and laughing, and quickly toss you into jail as a madman. This made you an honorary prisoner, kept for your entertainment value, but never free. Your chains weren't made of iron, but of absolute dependence on others' moods. And like all prisoners, you constantly dreamed of freedom, even knowing it was a dream that would never come true. Another terrifying detail. Many jesters were even tested for loyalty. A master might pretend to grant freedom, then watch to see if you tried to escape. If you did, the price could be whippings, exile, even death. So many jesters chose resignation, continuing their house-arrested life, just to stay alive. And so, day after day, year after year, you were confined in the golden cage called the court. You might hear roaring laughter in the great hall. You might juggle, dance, mock to delight the court. But when the feast ended and the candles died out, you returned to your small corner room, where no one cared if you existed, and you knew for certain you were never allowed to leave, ever. If life under house arrest had already turned court jesters into prisoners in castles, then there was another invisible but heavier chain, the fact that you had to always be funny. Not when you wanted, not when you felt like it, but at all times, everywhere, in any circumstance. Picture this. In the morning, when the Duke sat down to eat, the jester had to appear with a joke to lighten the mood. At noon, when the lady complained about the weather, the jester had to turn the rain into a laugh. In the evening, at banquets, when everyone was tipsy, the jester was dragged out to dance, mimic, and tell crude stories. And if, by misfortune, someone had just received bad news, a death in the family, a defeat on the battlefield, you had to become the curtain, forcing laughter to burst out and drive away the gloom. There were no pauses, no private moments. A jester's life was like a stage that never dropped its curtain. Even during rest, you were watched. If you sat still, looking pensive, someone would ask, "Why isn't the fool cheerful today?" A question that seemed harmless, but was full of danger, because it sowed doubt that you were no longer fulfilling your duty to entertain. The terrifying part was, you had to manufacture joy out of your own fragments. Some days you shivered with fever, yet still staggered out with a hoarse laugh. Some days you had just lost a loved one, yet still cracked jokes at a banquet, for nobles who neither knew nor cared that you were grieving. Sadness, anger, fatigue, all buried under the mask of humour. Even when you stumbled, were pelted with food, or shoved around, the laughter only grew louder. The more pain, the more humiliation, the more the audience enjoyed it. Being a jester was the only profession where suffering itself was success. The more shame you endured, the prouder your master was. The more foolish you looked, the more delighted the crowd became. And the day you could no longer perform, that was the day you were discarded. At long feasts, jesters were often the last still awake. When wine had knocked everyone out on the tables, when musicians had gone, you still had to entertain someone who refused to leave. You had no right to say no, because their amusement was your mission. If they were bored, you failed. If they were angry, you were doomed. That was why a jester's mind was always strung tight like a lute string. You had to observe every glance, every breath of the nobles. A single throat clearing could be a warning sign. A frown could be a blade at your throat. You had to be more adaptable than a diplomat, more tactful than a monk, yet never recognized. The only thing people saw in you was laughter, laughter that never belonged to you. The irony was, a jester's stage had no boundaries. It could be the great hall, the dining room, the corridor, even the bedchamber. Records tell of kings calling jesters into their private rooms, just to hear a joke before sleep. You became a sleeping pill made of laughter, something that eased them into dreams. But what about you? When the door closed, you returned quietly to your small corner, and no one cared whether you could sleep or not. A jester's life was thus a spiral with no escape. When everyone else slept, you were still performing. When everyone was happy, you had to be twice as happy. When everyone grieved, you had to hide your grief so they could laugh. And in all of that, there was no room for your real self. Many jesters learned to laugh even while crying. Many went mad after living the role too long, to the point where they no longer knew where the joke ended and the truth began. They became shadows of themselves, existing only to serve a stage that would never, ever lower its curtain. If court jesters lived on an endless stage, then their greatest tragedy was this: they were never allowed to show real emotions. Because in the world of the court, the moment you revealed even a little fatigue, sadness, or anger, you had already signed your own death sentence. Imagine being a jester at a crowded banquet. Red wine overflowing, roasted meat fragrant, laughter roaring, everyone clamouring for you to tell stories, to dance, to mimic. But inside, you were torn apart by the news that your mother had just died in a faraway village. You wanted to cry, to stay silent, but you couldn't. A single tear falling in front of nobles was enough to make them frown. What's wrong with this fool? How dare he be sad at my feast? Real feelings in their eyes were an insult. A jester was not allowed to grieve when others rejoiced, not allowed to be angry when mocked, not allowed to be silent when laughter was demanded. Your entire life, every personal emotion had to be buried under the mask of comedy. This forced many jesters to live in constant vigilance against their own souls. When you felt anger, you had to instantly turn it into a joke, a biting remark. When you felt sad, you had to twist it into a funny story. You rewrote your own true emotions to fit the powerful audience in front of you. And so, year after year, you gradually forgot what was real and what was fake. This fear was worse than the whip, because it ate away at you every day. A wound on the skin would heal, but a wound in the soul, when you were never allowed to be yourself, stayed for life. You could be cursed at, pelted with food, slapped in the face, but the deepest pain was when you were forced to smile, nod, and pretend it was all part of the act. It's no accident that many court jesters in history were described as half mad, half sane, because to survive, they had to go too deep into the role. They performed to the point they themselves believed they truly couldn't feel sadness, that they were born to be clowns. Others, in contrast, exploded after too long suppressing everything. There were jesters who, in a flash of rage, cursed a noble, and within hours were dragged away to execution. The irony was, because they were forced to hide their own feelings, jesters became the most sensitive to the feelings of others. You couldn't show your own grief, but you had to spot your master's grief in time to turn it into laughter. You couldn't show anger, but you had to detect the count's anger to joke quickly enough. Your whole life was like a distorted mirror, reflecting the emotions of others, but never daring to reveal your own. In a castle full of schemes, hiding emotions was also survival. If you seemed too clever, they hated you. If you looked tired, they scorned you. If you showed resentment, they suspected treason. So a jester had to become a master of the art of wearing a mask. The smile stuck to your skin, even when inside there were only tears. Perhaps the bitterest tragedy was at night, when everyone else slept, and you sat alone in your cramped room. Then, and only then, did your real feelings dare to surface. Tears soaking the pillow, sobs caught in your throat. But even then, you were afraid someone might hear. Afraid of being caught not being the endlessly cheerful fool they believed. Even in the dark, you couldn't be true to yourself. That is why court jesters are remembered not just as clowns, but as symbols of history's irony. Living a whole life to make others laugh, but never once truly being happy yourself. After the fear of never being able to show real emotions, there was another harsher reality that court jesters had to face: their living quarters. Outsiders might think, at least they lived in a castle. Surely it was luxurious. Maybe not like nobles, but better than peasants outside. But the truth was completely the opposite. The jesters' quarters were usually shabby, cramped rooms, no different from storage closets, often right next to the kitchen. The reason was simple. Jesters were not nobles, not knights, not even regular servants. They belonged to an outcast category. Nobles had upper floors with velvet rooms. Guards had quarters near the gates. Maids and workers had their own dormitories. And jesters? No one knew where to place them, so they were shoved into some corner, usually an old storage room near the kitchen or a damp hallway nook. Picture that room: stone walls soaking with moisture, winter so cold your breath turned to smoke, summer heavy with grease and smoke from the kitchen. The floor covered with straw, not clean straw but scraps from horse stalls or old sacks. At night, the sound of rats gnawing crept around, water dripping through cracks echoed. Even when the great hall blazed with candlelight, the place you returned to was only the cold darkness of a room where even hounds sometimes slept more comfortably. Living next to the kitchen meant you breathed in foul mixtures every day: burning grease, scorched onions and garlic, wastewater poured from basins, and the stench of rotting meat. While nobles enjoyed fine dishes at the table, jesters curled up in the dark, inhaling it all. And ironically, this only underlined their low status. You lived near food but never tasted the best. What you got were leftovers, sometimes tossed straight to the floor. That cramped space was also a way to keep jesters on call, because being near the kitchen and banquet hall meant you were always within reach. Lying tired in your corner, just one shout, "Bring the fool here!" and you had to spring up, rush to the hall, smile and perform. Your room wasn't a place to rest, but like a cage where the beast was kept until dragged out for amusement. The bitterest part was the comparison. When you stood in the banquet hall, you saw noblemen on velvet chairs, noblewomen in fox furs, and just a few steps away, you knew your place was the stinking little storage room. That short physical distance was actually a vast gulf of status. You were in the same castle, but you never belonged to it. Some records say many jesters had to share their rooms with discarded objects. broken barrels of wine, splintered furniture, worn-out kitchen tools. Some were even forced to sleep on the kitchen floor itself, crowded with rats and cats. You had no right to choose where you lived, no right to decorate or improve it. If you complained, they laughed. What does a fool need with a fine bed? As long as you're alive to perform, that's enough. That squalor reflected exactly how the powerful saw them. Jesters weren't people, so they didn't need decent quarters. You weren't considered a guest, nor a proper servant. You could stay anywhere, as long as you were close enough to be summoned, and far enough not to offend their eyes. That limbo, unrecognized, not belonging, was the true thorn in the heart. Perhaps the greatest tragedy was this. Many jesters lived in castles for decades, bringing laughter to countless feasts. But when they died, their tiny rooms vanished without a trace. People cleared them like trash closets, then gave them to the next fool. No memorial statue, no honourable gravestone, only a rusty bell rolling in the dark corner. That cramped little room by the kitchen, from the outside, was just a small detail in the massive structure of the castle. But for the jester, it was a private prison, proof of a despised life. It was the place you entered with a forced smile, and the place you returned to, night after night, in silence and cold, waiting for tomorrow, when the call would come again, and you had to step out and perform, as if you had never had a life of your own. The shabby living quarters already showed how court jesters were pushed to the margins of castle luxury, but their social status was an even greater tragedy, because jesters didn't really belong to any class. They weren't nobles, obviously, but they weren't peasants either. They existed in between, a strange space where no one knew what to call them or where to place them. In medieval society, everyone had a clearly defined place. Peasants tied to the land, feeding the whole system. Blacksmiths, tailors, carpenters, commoners, but essential. Nobles held power, fought, ruled. Priests and bishops cared for the soul. But jesters produced no food, made no tools, wielded no weapons, bestowed no blessings. They existed only to laugh, and because of that, they were seen as outsiders, those who didn't fit into the established order. This put jesters into a paradox. On one hand, they had rare privileges, sitting near the king at banquets, speaking in satire without being immediately beheaded, moving around the castle without rank. But at the same time, they had no real rights. They weren't respected like nobles, nor pitied like peasants. They were in between, and no one really wanted to stand close to them. Peasants looked at jesters with strangeness. To them, jesters no longer belonged to the village, no longer shared the hardship of ploughing fields, paying taxes, fearing hunger. Jesters lived in castles close to kings, so they were seen as belonging to the other side. But nobles never considered jesters part of them either. In their eyes, jesters were only living toys, tools of amusement. They could laugh with jesters, but never raise a glass as equals. Living in this outsider role, jesters were forced to walk a tightrope between two worlds. With peasants, they were no longer villagers. With nobles, they were never respected. That limbo made their lives forever lonely. You had no roots in any community. You existed like a shadow, an echo in the great hall, but never truly as a person. The pain was that this outsider status made jesters easy scapegoats. When nobles needed someone to blame for dull atmospheres, the jester was the first target. When the people needed a symbol to mock for the extravagance of courts, they pointed to the jester. When a banquet mishap happened, spilled wine, dropped food, often it was pinned on the fool. Belonging to no side meant you could be cast aside at any time. This outsider status also showed clearly in rituals. While nobles sat at leather-covered chairs, peasants ate portions outside. The jester stood in between, close enough to hear commands, far enough not to offend noble eyes. They weren't listed in village rolls, nor in court records. In official documents, often only a line, "The fool of my lord," a human reduced to entertainment. Loneliness became a lifelong sentence. You had no neighbours, no colleagues to share with. Even servants in the castle, also lowly, kept their distance. They feared you might overhear something and use it as a joke. They feared you'd report to nobles. You became a stranger, even in the place you lived for decades. Sometimes, this outsider role gave jesters a strange power. Because they belonged to no side, they could say things no one else dared. A joke, a satire could expose truths both nobles and peasants avoided. But it was a double-edged sword. Said at the right time, you were clever. Said at the wrong moment, you were a traitor. The greatest tragedy was, jesters never had an escape from this status. You couldn't become a noble, no land, no bloodline. You couldn't return to being a peasant. Too long gone, no tie to farming, and villages wouldn't take you back. You were forever stuck in between, existing like a strange creature society didn't know how to classify. That outsider status may have been the most terrifying invisible chain. Prisoners at least knew where they were locked. Peasants knew which village they belonged to, but jesters belonged nowhere. You lived in castles but weren't considered part of them. You once were a villager but no longer one. You existed as if you didn't exist, a drifting identity, laughed at while alive and forgotten the moment you died. If the jester's status was already a limbo, belonging nowhere, then the most painful part of that fate was this. All of their talents were dismissed. You could be an outstanding musician, a brilliant poet, a creative performer, but in the castle, everything you did was reduced to a silly act for amusement. Picture this. A jester who could play the lute. In another setting, he could have been a renowned musician, carrying his songs through markets, praised by the people. But in the castle, when he strummed, nobles laughed that he plucks like a cat scratching, or made noise on purpose to turn his music into background for their rowdy laughter. His artistry wasn't respected as art, but mocked as fodder. Or another jester, skilled in improvised verse. He could rhyme quickly, satirize sharply. But those verses were never recorded like the works of court poets. They were remembered for a fleeting moment, laughed at, then disappeared like wine smoke in the banquet hall. He wasn't a poet, he was just a parrot that rhymed. Even satire, which could have been social critique, sharp, fearless, like Aristophanes once did in Greek comedy, was reduced in medieval courts to a fool's banter. If the jester's wit pleased the master, everyone roared with laughter. If it touched a sore spot of the powerful, it instantly became treason. You were never acknowledged as someone speaking truth, only as an insolent clown. This disdain showed in every detail. A formal musician had a seat, a name in the register, invitations for festivals. A jester was dragged out on a whim, playing lute while chicken bones were thrown at his head. A court poet could recite before the queen, rewarded, copied down. A jester's verse was spat out at feasts, drowned by burps and vulgar laughter. An actor had a stage, an attentive audience. A jester performed among dishes, interrupted any time by the master's orders. And when a jester performed too well, that was even more dangerous. If your song made a lady weep, if your poem made guests gasp, your master grew uneasy. What does a fool know of art? Don't let him think he's our equal. And so, you were humiliated on purpose, forced to bray like a donkey while reciting poetry, or made to dance absurdly right after playing music. Your talent was always dragged into the mud, to remind you that you were never more than a fool. The irony was, that very disdain erased so much real value. Many jesters truly had creative gifts, but were never acknowledged. They left no name in art history, no legacy of works. They were artists imprisoned in a mask of comedy, their talents reduced to fleeting echoes in feasts, vanishing in oblivion. Their pain was like living in a distorted theatre. You had a stage, but were never called an actor. You had an audience, but were never seen as an artist. You had applause, but it was mocking laughter, not admiration. And when the candles went out, the laughter faded. You returned to your dark room, carrying the emptiness. All your efforts, all your talents, remembered only as a fool's act. If all the talents of court jesters were dismissed, then ironically the only moment they were most noticed was when they failed. People didn't really laugh because you were skilled. They laughed the loudest when you stumbled, when you hurt yourself, when you turned into a joke in the literal sense. At a lavish banquet, a jester might juggle 3 apples, so skillfully that each one sparkled in the candlelight. But the guests only smirked. Then when he slipped, An apple hit his head, or rolled onto the table and spilled a nobleman's wine. The entire hall exploded with laughter. That laughter wasn't admiration, it was delight in failure. The tragedy of jesters was this: your success was only the prelude, failure was the climax. If you did it right, the audience chuckled lightly. If you did it wrong, the audience roared. And so your whole life turned into a series of fake falls, staged stumbles, humiliating antics to keep laughter alive. The more powerful the noble, the more cruel their laughter. A count might order, "Fall down, fall in a funny way," and you had to, even if your bones ached, even if you scraped and bled. They wanted to see you hurt in a ridiculous way, to feel higher, stronger, safer. That laughter was like a blade, slicing away the last scraps of your dignity. Records tell of many jesters forced to pretend to be drunk, staggering, then collapsing face first on the floor. The crowd roared, even threw chicken bones and fruit as props. If you got up too quickly, they'd say, "Fall again, make it funnier this time." And you weren't allowed to refuse, because refusal meant insulting your master. This delight in failure also turned jesters into psychological punching bags. When nobles were frustrated by defeat in war, in chess, or by a bad day, they needed someone to vent on. And the jester was perfect, weak, powerless, born to be humiliated. They could shove you into mud, make you slap your own face, all under the label of entertainment. The bitterness was, the more humiliation, the louder the laughter, the more pain, the greater the success. You became a living symbol of failure, but not their failure, yours. They watched you fall as a reminder. We are high above, he is far below. We are strong, he is weak. That forced many jesters to learn how to turn pain into a tool. They fell artistically, fell in ways that looked funny instead of pathetic. They knew how to tumble without breaking bones, how to spin a fall into a new trick. But no matter how skillful, the shame never lessened. Because in the end, the audience didn't care about your skill. They just wanted to see you fail. Over a lifetime, jesters were trained to treat failure as their profession. You stopped dreaming of praise for talent. You only learned to fake stupidity to survive. And the most horrifying part was, after many years, you began to believe your only value was foolishness. You forgot you once knew poetry, music, sharp satire. You only remembered how to fall to make the hall erupt. That, the most fun is failure, was deep down a mirror of feudal society. The powerful roared when seeing the lowly stumble, because in that laughter their status was reinforced. They needed you as proof that there was always someone beneath them, always someone suffering humiliation so they could shine. And so jesters lived their whole lives in a loop, stepping out, performing, success bland, failure glorious. But the glory wasn't yours, it was for someone else's laughter. You became the embodiment of a cruel truth. In the medieval court, sometimes the only thing that truly made people laugh was watching another human being stumble and suffer right before their eyes. In daily life, court jesters were forced to laugh, to fall, to perform. But when it came to festivals and banquets, moments of flaunted power and luxury, their status became even more miserable. Because in those very places, they turned into society's punching bags, where all the tension, anger, and arrogance of the powerful were poured out. Picture a winter banquet in the great hall of a castle. Candles blazing on great chandeliers, red wine poured into goblets, the table lined with roasted meat, salmon, white bread, rich cheese, lords and ladies in furs, silks, glittering jewelry, music rising from the musicians. In the midst of it all, the jester was dragged out, not like an artist invited to perform, but like a mandatory spice to make the banquet fun. Here, laughter became a tool to maintain order. Nobles laughed to prove they were relaxed, powerful, enjoying themselves. And the jester was the excuse, the instrument to make that laughter happen. You were forced to juggle, mimic, mock guests, even dance absurdly in the middle of the hall. If you did well, laughter erupted. If you misspoke, the mood dropped, and all eyes turned on you as though you had insulted the entire feast. Nowhere was it easier for jesters to become punching bags than at the banquet table. When wine flowed, people grew coarse, aggressive. One joke from a jester could make a drunken lord snap, and instead of restraining himself, he might hurl his wine in your face, or slap you just to prove his power. The crowd around him? They'd roar with laughter, treating it as part of the show. The jester's humiliation became fuel for everyone else's joy. Not just a target of anger, the jester was also a mirror for nobles to flaunt their wit. When a jester mocked, a lord or lady could respond cleverly, and everyone applauded them. In truth, the jester's joke was only the spark, the excuse for nobles to show off. You were never the centre, only the target for others to throw at and then boast. At festivals, this was even harsher. When the whole community gathered, peasants and nobles alike, jesters were pulled out to perform before the crowd. But here, you faced not just the powerful, but also the people's eyes. They laughed, but inside their laughter was scorn. Look, the fool who survives only by tricks. You were turned into common entertainment, trampled publicly before all classes. The famous Feast of Fools in Europe was the clearest example. On that day, order was overturned, priests mocked, church rituals parodied, and the jester became the centre of chaos. People laughed, shouted, ridiculed, and the jester bore both roles, culprit and victim. You were the one making jokes, but also the scapegoat for all the anger allowed to erupt one day a year. At the banquet table, jesters were often turned into brutal amusements, sometimes forced to drink until collapsing, with laughter when they vomited and staggered. Sometimes made to eat bizarre things, bones, scraps, just so nobles could enjoy their grimaces. Every cruel act wrapped in the disguise of entertainment, and the jester had no right to refuse. The pain was, festivals and banquets, which should have been joyful, became the places where jester's weakness was most exposed. When the whole castle roared with laughter, when everyone raised glasses, you, the one who created that laughter, were the only one feeling like a rug trampled underfoot. Imagine, after the feast ended, the music stopped, candles burned low, everyone left in drunken satisfaction. And you? You dragged yourself back to the little storage room by the kitchen, your clothes stained with grease, wine, and filth thrown at you. You had just played the lead role in a long play, but there was no applause, no admiration, only silence, exhaustion, and humiliation clinging to you. In festivals and banquets, court jesters were not just bringers of joy. They were targets for society to vent tension, to pour anger, to reinforce power. They became living punching bags, enduring everything, so others could feel higher, stronger, happier. And that was the bitter truth hidden behind the roaring laughter in the great halls of the Middle Ages. In drunkenness, in the roar of cheers, nobles didn't just want to hear you tell stories, dance, and perform. They wanted to mock you, humiliate you, turn you into a living joke right before everyone's eyes. One of the familiar moments was the jester's hat being snatched off. The hat, often with jingling bells at the tips, was the symbol of his role, both his identity and his mask. But at banquets, a powerful man could suddenly yank it off, shove it into someone else's hands, or put it on his own head and laugh. Look at me, now I'm the fool. The hall burst into laughter, while you, stripped of the last cover protecting you, stood exposed in the glare of mocking eyes. Food throwing was also part of the fun. Chicken bones, fruit peels, chunks of bread, all could come flying at you. At first it was just a joke, tossed lightly to see how you'd react. But then it became habit. The more people threw, the louder the laughter. If you dodged, they grew angry. How dare the fool not take my joke? So you were forced to endure it, letting stains stick to your clothes, letting pain sear as bones smacked your face. In the haze of drink, the jokes could go even further. Someone might force the jester to drain a huge jug of wine, then cheer as he staggered and vomited. Someone might make him crawl under the table, barking like a dog to make everyone howl with laughter. Someone might grab his hair, dragging him into the hall just to prove, even a human, I can turn into a toy. And all of it, in their eyes, was just entertainment. The humiliation cut deeper because it was public, in front of so many eyes. Nobles laughed, servants laughed too. No one defended you, no one stopped it. You had only two choices. Pretend to play along, turn your pain into part of the act, or endure silently. Either way leading to the same result. Their laughter only grew louder. Chronicles describe many jesters returning to their rooms after banquets in tatters. Faces bruised, clothes smeared with grease, hats torn apart. But the next morning, they still had to clean up, patch it together, put it back on, and keep performing as if nothing had happened. The shame didn't stop in the moment. It piled up, day after day, becoming a shadow haunting them for life. The hat and its jingling bells, symbols of their profession, became chains binding them to humiliation. People looked at the hat and laughed, never seeing the person beneath. People hurled chicken bones into your face without thinking it an insult, because to them you weren't truly human, only a living toy for amusement. The bitterness was, many jesters learned to turn humiliation itself into talent. You were pelted with bones, pick them up, juggle them, keep the laughter going. Your hat was snatched. Make a silly face, grin, act like it was your idea all along. You became an accomplice to your own humiliation, because it was the only way to survive. But deep inside, you knew, every throw, every laugh, cut into your dignity like a dull blade. You dared not rage, dared not cry, dared not leave. You could only keep laughing, keep enduring, keep performing. And then one day, you even forgot what it felt like to be truly human, leaving only the faint shadow of someone who existed only to be mocked. Amid all the humiliations of feasts and festivals, there's one truth few notice. The court jester was not only the one who endured, they also possessed a secret weapon, their ears. Because their lowly, despised position allowed them to become silent witnesses to countless secrets of the court. Think about it. Jesters were always present everywhere. In the great hall, when nobles discussed state matters between courses, the jester sat there pretending to be foolish, juggling a few apples. In the corridors, when two officials argued, the jester happened to loiter, humming a nonsense tune. In private chambers, when the king needed amusement to ease his stress, the jester was summoned, standing by the bed, overhearing laments about politics, fears of rebellion. This constant, invisible presence turned the jester into the unseen ears of the court. Everyone looked down on the fool, so no one bothered to hide in front of them. Nobles drunk with wine spoke their true hearts. Ladies gossiped about bedroom secrets. Officials plotted schemes, assuming no one else understood. But the jester heard it all. They knew more than guards, more than advisors, because they were everywhere no one expected. And here lay the paradox. The one treated as a toy became a living treasury of information. The ears of a fool gathered countless plots, whispers, and truths that should never escape. From the count drowning in debt, on the edge of betrayal, to the lady secretly with her knight. From tax hikes bound to anger the people, to fears of uprising inside the castle, the jester knew everything, but could never speak. Yet because of this, the jester's fear and caution never rested. A single slip of the tongue could turn their knowledge into proof for a death sentence. If you let it slip that you'd heard something, nobles instantly saw you as a threat. And in a world where a fool's words carried no weight, they could kill you to protect their secrets, blaming it on drunkenness or madness, and no one would care. But those ears weren't only a danger, sometimes they became rare protection. Some jesters learned to use what they knew to their advantage. They joked at the right moment, hinting at a secret only one person would understand. The powerful one paled, realizing, this fool knows. Better keep him alive, or at least don't provoke him. And so, the paradox struck. The lowliest one could sometimes threaten the mighty, not with sword or wealth, but with what they knew. Stories tell of clever jesters who became hidden advisors. They never spoke plainly, but through jokes and hints, they nudged kings toward truths no one else dared say. A quip about the count's sick horse could alert the king to signs of rebellion. A joke about the lady who sleeps more with the guard could warn the queen of betrayal. Those ears and that foolish mouth, when used well, became subtle political tools. Of course, walking that line was deadly dangerous. The jester had to know how much to say, where to stop, how to cloak it so only the right person understood. Too clear, and you were seen as scheming. Too vague, and you lost all value. That fragile balance turned many jesters into masters of the art of speaking without saying, laughing while warning. In truth, the ears of the jester were the only weapon they ever had in a crushed life. They had no sword, no land, no freedom. But they could listen. And sometimes, just listening was enough to shift the game. A noble's frown at a jest could halt a plot. A forced laugh could expose a truth hidden from the court. Yet the tragedy remained. The jester was never officially acknowledged for this weapon. History rarely recorded them as diplomats, informants, or thinkers. All that remains are anecdotes, legends, fragments passed down. Their ears heard everything, but their names were buried in eternal silence. That was the final paradox of the secret weapon. The ears that let jesters survive, sometimes saving their lives, even changing history, also chained them to a life of fear, condemned them to forever remain outsiders, never recognized as truly human. If the jester's ears were a secret weapon, then what they faced every day was even more terrifying: the fire of the king's moods. Because in a medieval castle, nothing was more dangerous than the shifting temper of the one who held absolute power. And the fool, the one standing closest, was the one most directly affected. Imagine an ordinary day in the palace. In the morning, the king wakes in good spirits. He's just won a game of chess, just received news his soldiers crushed a revolt. He calls for the jester, orders a story. You crack a joke? He laughs. The court laughs. The air feels light, as if you've brought sunshine into the palace. You feel useful, maybe even a flicker of pride. But only hours later, bad news arrives. The granary has burned, or a messenger reports defeat at the border. The king's face darkens, his voice heavy as stone. He turns toward you, and in that instant, fear races down your spine. Because now, you must make him laugh, extinguish the fire of rage flaring inside him. But if you say the wrong thing, if your joke stabs the raw wound just opened, you become the fuel for that fire. The court jester lived in a world where every breath, every glance of the king was a command. When the king was happy, you could survive. When the king was sad, you bore the weight of his grief. Your nearness to the throne gave you the right to listen, to speak, but it also placed you at the front lines of his volatility. The fire of the king's moods was dangerous because it erupted without warning, without pattern. One moment, you've made him laugh with a joke about his hunting dog. The next, he's roaring, hurling a goblet against the wall over some trivial slight. And you, standing nearby, must somehow turn that explosion into comedy, or at least absorb it so no one else pays the price. Records tell of jesters executed for a single joke at the wrong time. A king mourning his child heard the fool mention little ones. The death sentence fell. A king defeated in battle heard a jest about a broken horse. The fool was branded traitor. That fire needed no reason. It only needed to burn. And the jester was the driest tinder. Ironically, this forced jesters to become masters of reading moods. They studied every frown, every tap of a finger, every twitch. They learned to gauge how happy, how sad, how furious the king was that day. Their entire life was the art of reading and living by one man's emotions. One slip, one misjudgment, could turn a smile into a death sentence. That fire of moods trapped the jester in a vicious loop. If the king was happy, you were summoned. If the king was sad, you were summoned even more. If the king was enraged, you were dragged in to soothe him. In other words, no matter what state he was in, you were never free. You were chained to the throne, your face shifting with the ruler's moods. Perhaps the most terrifying part was knowing this truth. Happy or sad, your life or death depended entirely on one man. You could be talented, you could be clever, but if today the king woke angry, it was over. His moods were like a smouldering volcano, and you danced every day on its rim, laughing as the abyss yawned beneath your feet. And here was the bitter paradox. The jester was the bringer of laughter, yet also the one who trembled most before the smile and rage of a single man. They were not allowed moods of their own, because the only mood that mattered belonged to someone else. In history, perhaps no fate was more tragic. A life lived in the gaze of the throne, yet only as a flickering candle before a great fire, ready to be snuffed out at any moment. While the fire of the king's moods could burn anyone nearby, the court jester had a strange privilege. They were one of the few allowed to speak the truth. But the paradox was, That right only existed inside the shell of a joke, and at any moment it could turn into a blade against them. In medieval society, nearly everyone had to bow their heads. Nobles only dared whisper behind backs. Officials chose their words carefully, speaking with trembling voices. But the jester, the one most despised, could mock the king, ridicule counts, and poke fun at bishops to their faces. As long as it was in laughter, as long as it was considered a performance. For example, a jester could step into a banquet, point at the king's new cloak and say, "Beautiful," though a shame it's stitched from the peasants' taxes. The hall roared with laughter. The king might flush red, but he laughed too, because denying too harshly would kill the mood. In that moment, the naked truth slipped out, but floated away like a wisp of wine smoke, because it was all wrapped in a joke. This was the strange power of the fool. They were a mirror of society, saying what everyone knew but dared not speak. And sometimes, the truth spoken through a jester made the king think. A joke could become a warning. A performance could spark awareness. Sometimes, laughter was the only way truth could survive in a world of lies. But this privilege was also the deadliest double-edged sword. The line between clever satire and insult was razor thin. Today, the king was merry, and you could joke about battlefield defeats. Tomorrow, he was furious, and the same joke could cost your life. No one could predict moods, and the fool's fate depended entirely on that. Worse still, the jester didn't just face the king, but the entire court. When you mocked a noble, the banquet might erupt with laughter, but the one mocked remembered. The next day, he whispered to the king, "That fool was insolent last night. Perhaps he hides treason." And with a nod, a harmless joke became a death sentence. Many stories tell of the cleverest jesters hiding truth in layers. They never spoke directly, but cloaked it in metaphor, allegory, or by making themselves the idiot in the tale. For example, instead of saying, "The king is overtaxing," the fool might tell a story about a cow milked to death. Everyone laughed. The king laughed too, but in his mind, alarm bells rang. That was the art of survival in jest, speaking truth while seeming not to, striking while stroking. Still, truth was always dangerous. A fool might survive by wit, but one slip, and everything was gone. So many learned to play mad, acting as if they didn't know what they were saying, as if every joke was just silly nonsense. That madness was their armor, shielding them when the truth cut too sharply. The right to speak truth in jest, on the surface, looked like a privilege, but in reality, it was a trap. It made the jester believe they had power, that they could mock even the king, but that power rested entirely on someone else's passing mood. A power as fragile as wine foam in a cup, gleaming as it rose but bursting the instant it was touched. And so, the jester lived a life of dangerous balance, both truth-teller and self-concealer, able to make the king laugh, but just as likely to spark his wrath. That privilege, looked at closely, was nothing but a rope hanging loose around the neck, letting you walk freely, but tightening to choke the moment you slipped. The inevitable that followed was the terrible price of truth. Because in a medieval court, truth was not a gift, but contraband. And when it slipped from a jester's mouth, even wrapped in laughter, it could turn into a death sentence at any moment. Imagine a crowded banquet. The king is drunk, courtiers clapping, the air alive. The fool is summoned, dancing and joking. There are counts who wear velvet and eat fat meat, yet leave their fields barren so the peasants starve. Laughter erupts, a few elbows nudge, some realizing the joke points to a real man. The king laughs too, but his face darkens for a moment. In that instant, the fool has spoken a truth no one dared say, and from that moment on, his fate begins to slide into danger. The price of truth came in two layers. The first was the fury of the one singled out. No noble could endure being made a joke, especially in front of the king. One quip could strip them of honor, and in a world where honor was everything, losing face meant losing power. So they sought revenge. Maybe in the feast itself, with a slap, a kick. Maybe later, with a whisper to the king. This fool has crossed the line. Letting him live is letting the low mock the throne. The second layer was even more dangerous. The king himself. When truth hit the nerve of power, the reaction was rarely reflection. It was punishment. Some kings could be tolerant, taking it as clever warning, but many saw it as insult. They didn't want reminders they were weak, wrong, or losing prestige. And the fool, the one who dared speak it, became the offender of the sacred. One command, and the fool could vanish as if he never existed. The bitter irony was, fools knew this price, yet still had to keep speaking, because if they only played silly tricks, they became dull, useless. It was the sharp sting of bitter truth that made a joke bite, that made the hall erupt. So, to survive, the jester had to play the dangerous game, speak just enough truth to impress, but not too much to summon death. Some clever jesters learned to cloak truth indirectly. They used allegory, parables, turned truth into tales of cows, dogs, or invented figures. But even that gave no guarantee. Once power felt touched, no disguise mattered. And truth, no matter how deeply wrapped in laughter, could still cut the throat of the one who spoke it. Stories linger of fools who died for a single joke. A Polish jester in the 15th century mocked his king for losing a fortress. Days later, his body was found in the stables. Another in England teased a powerful lady, and by morning he was cast from the court, vanishing into nothing. Those deaths weren't accidents, they were blood payment for truth. The price also came in quieter form. Fools lived in constant fear. Every word spoken, every laugh raised, carried danger. You didn't dare sleep soundly, knowing last night's joke might have reached the wrong ears. You didn't dare trust anyone, because the one who laughed loudest might be the first to stab you later. Truth made you stand out, but it also made you a target. The paradox was, the fool's truth sometimes was the only thing keeping power balanced. A satire could make a king reconsider. A joke could stop a wrong decision. But fools were never credited as wise. They were only remembered as entertainers. And the price they paid, fear, humiliation, even death, was never recorded in the chronicles. Another tragedy of the fool ran even deeper. They never had an escape from their profession. In medieval society, a peasant could hope for a new life by joining the army, fighting bravely, and being granted land. A blacksmith could open his own forge, pass his trade to his children, and build a strong lineage. A monk could climb the steps of the church, from a humble brother to a powerful bishop. But a fool? Never. Once you put on the cap with bells, you were trapped for life in that despised role. First, fools had no side trade. You had no land to till, no skill to craft for survival. You couldn't leave the court to open a shop, sell goods, or join a guild. Your whole life had been trained, or rather forced, to perform. And beyond the joke, you had nothing to cling to. Second, fools had no ladder of advancement. A peasant could become a soldier could be knighted, a clerk could become a counsellor, but a fool would never become an official, never a noble. You could sit beside the king, you could make him laugh, but you would never be invited to discuss state matters. Your place was forever a shadow at the feast. Third, fools had no safe exit. When you grew old, when your jokes lost edge, when your juggling slowed, you couldn't retire like a clerk or a monk. You had only two choices: keep performing under pity, or be replaced by a younger fool and discarded. Many ended their lives in poverty, wandering outside the gates, forgotten by all who once laughed at them. That is why being a fool was a locked cage. Once inside, you could never get out. Even if you wanted to quit, society wouldn't allow it. If you left, villagers saw you as a madman. If you begged to farm again, no one believed a man who had once capered in castles could till like a peasant. And if you dreamed of another trade, you quickly realized you had nothing but warped laughter. The tragedy was heavier still for those born crippled or deformed, the very traits that marked them for jest. For them, being a fool wasn't just a role, it was destiny. Their bodies branded them forever. When they aged, long gone from the court, they were still seen as the fool. They carried that label to the grave, with no escape. Some fools tried to use their secret weapon, overheard truths and knowledge, to escape, hoping to be valued as advisors. But the price was too high. Either they were killed for knowing too much, or they remained despised, never truly acknowledged. A joke was always a joke, even if it carried wisdom. The cruelest cut was this. Even in history's memory, fools had no escape. Kings filled chronicles, nobles had names carved in stone, knights were sung in ballads, monks remembered in holy texts. Fools vanished. They lived lifetimes in castles, witnessed upheavals, but when they died, their names disappeared as if they never existed. The laughter they created dissolved like wine fumes at the banquet, with no one preserving it, no one remembering, no escape from the profession. That was the invisible chain binding the court jester. They had no choice in beginning, no choice in ending, and no right to change. Their life was like a puppet, pulled to dance, to fall, to laugh. And when the strings snapped, the puppet fell, only to be quietly swept away, replaced by another. For the fool, legacy was not glory, not masterpieces to outlive them, but only forgetting. Think of it. When a knight died, he left behind a sword and a crest, hung in the great hall, passed down to his heirs. A monk left behind scriptures, manuscripts, ideas written into history. A noble left land, castles, his name carved into stone. But a fool? When they died, what remained was often only a tattered cap with bells, a few faint laughs in someone's memory, memories that faded as quickly as wine fumes after a feast. The tragedy of legacy lay in invisibility. Fools were everywhere, in festivals, at banquets, in palace corridors. They witnessed every plot, every celebration, every crucial moment. They laughed when the king triumphed, laughed when he failed, laughed even when the court was drowned in mourning. But when history was written, no one mentioned them. Their names vanished, as if they had never existed. The bitterness went deeper. Even what they left behind was distorted. In some folk tales, the fool appeared only as a silly, despised figure. Their laughter was reduced to foolery, synonymous with worthlessness. Any wisdom hidden inside, any truth once spoken, was shrunk down to throwaway jokes. The legacy of fools was not respect, but mockery. Some talented fools could compose poetry, write music, even stage little plays, but no work was ever recorded under their names. If lucky, it was copied under that of a court poet. If not, it was lost forever. Fools became ghosts of creation. They made, but no one credited. They spoke truths, but no one remembered. Even their intangible legacy, the memory of laughter, never lasted. People might recall a joke for a few days, a few weeks, but then it vanished, replaced by newer amusements. Their names were never sung in ballads, never passed down like the stories of knights. After one generation, they were erased. The irony was that many fools knew this truth. They once laughed at their own fate. I laugh for the whole court, but when I die, no one will laugh for me. In the very laughter they created was hidden bitter pessimism. They knew they were only temporary tools, never eternal legacies. The only legacy society remembered of fools was the image of the clown, a symbol of stupidity, of cheap amusement. But that image was not the real person, only the shadow. It erased the flesh and blood human beings who had lived, endured, and often knew more than an entire court. It flattened them into a hollow, simple, empty symbol. And that was the greatest tragedy of the fool's legacy, to live a whole life under candlelight, in laughter, among the most powerful. But when the curtain fell, you left behind nothing but a faint echo, with no one to mention you, no one to carve your name. While other figures of the Middle Ages left castles, ballads, treaties, or battles recorded in chronicles, the fool left only a void full of lost laughter and nameless shame. If the tragedy of the court fool was having no legacy, then the even more bitter truth was that their death also sank into silence. No trumpets, no farewell songs, no gravestone with their name, just a quiet end, as if they had never existed. Picture this. After years of being called up at any moment, forced to dance while sick, humiliated under laughter and chicken bones thrown at them, the fool's body slowly gave out. Bones ached from constant falls, lungs choked from smoke and wine, skin festered from living in a damp storeroom by the kitchens. And then, one winter morning, the fool did not wake up. No funeral horns. No one shouted, "Where's the fool? Come perform!" Just the body of a human lying there, silent. In medieval society, Every class had its own death rites. Nobles were buried in stone vaults, with tombs, statues, and inscriptions praising their deeds. Knights who fell in battle were sung in ballads, their names passed down for generations. Even peasants had village cemeteries, family mourning, and handfuls of earth to cover them. But fools? They were often buried hastily behind the castle, in a patch of waste ground, no stone, no trace. Sometimes they were not even buried, just tossed into a common pit for the lowest servants. No one wept for fools. Nobles didn't. They never saw fools as people, only tools of amusement. Servants didn't. They feared trouble if they showed pity for someone no one valued. Villagers didn't. The fool had long ceased to belong to the community. And so their death passed like a blink, leaving no mark. The tragic part was that by the very next day, the court had found another fool. Laughter rang again in the hall. Feasts carried on. No one mentioned the one who had just died, as if they had only replaced a broken cup with a new one, with no thought of keeping the shards. Perhaps the only thing left was the fool's cap, bells bent and broken, tossed in a corner of a storeroom. But even that cap would be handed to the successor, as if the person had never existed, only the role. The fool died, but the fooling went on. Some tales record fools dying in the middle of performing. They collapsed on the floor, a crooked smile still on their face. At first, the crowd roared with laughter, thinking it part of the act. Only when the body stayed still did the laughter fade into awkwardness. But then, the feast resumed, wine poured again, music rose. The fool's death, even in their last moment, was treated as an unfinished joke. That silence lingered even after they were gone. No song sang of them, no chronicle recorded their names. No grave stood through the years. They were remembered by no one, prayed for by no one. Their existence was like a play erased from the audience's memory the moment the lights went out. That was the ultimate tragedy of the court fool. To live in humiliation, to die in silence. They laughed for others all their lives, but when they left, no one shed a tear. In a world where everyone left a trace, be it castles, swords, songs, or even a small grave, fools vanished as if they had never lived. And perhaps that was the cruelest laugh of history, a laugh that no longer echoed, and no one even cared enough to mourn. The silent death of the court fool was already a tragedy, but what was even more cruel was that right after, they were replaced coldly, quickly, without a shred of regret. In the court, laughter was never allowed to stop. When a fool fell, whether by sickness, old age, or the king's wrath, the gap left behind never lasted long. Just a few days later, a new fool was brought in, younger, stronger, ready to don the cap with bells and keep dancing. There was no memorial, no mention of service. Nobles simply clapped and called, "Bring in the new one, give us our amusement." And so, the laughter went on, as if nothing had happened. The old one vanished from memory, the new one instantly took their place, and the cycle continued, cold and unfeeling. This replacement reflected a bitter truth. In the eyes of the powerful, fools were not people, but tools. A broken tool was discarded, a new one taken. They didn't care how long the fool had been at their side, how many times he had made them laugh, how many court secrets he had witnessed. All of it was erased the moment someone else appeared. Many fools, even while alive, already felt the shadow of replacement hovering over them. Every time they fell sick, every time their jokes lost sharpness, they heard the whispers, "This fool's time is almost up, better find another." The fear of being replaced forced them to push harder, perform more, laugh louder, fall harder, to prove they still had value. But in the end, all that effort only bought them a little more time, never a different ending. In some castles, new fools were recruited even before the old ones had died. Two fools coexisted, but in truth, it was a hidden contest. Whoever entertained better stayed, the other was cast aside. That was not only cruel, but also a declaration. You were never unique, you were only a role, and this role can be filled by anyone else. The most painful part was the indifference of those who once laughed because of you. The king might once have laughed to tears at your juggling. A lady might once have clapped at your imitation of the guards. But once you were gone, They didn't even bother remembering your name. They only needed a new face, a new laugh. Any attachment, if it existed at all, lasted no longer than a goblet of wine. The fool's loneliness, therefore, was not just in life, but continued even after death. You left no gap in anyone's heart, because the gap was filled instantly. You were replaced, erased, swallowed whole in the cold cycle of entertainment. Worse still, replacement distorted memory itself. When the new fool stepped in, he wore the old cap, held the old staff, performed the same routines. Little by little, the audience could no longer tell whose jokes belonged to whom. Everything blurred together, and the past disappeared. You weren't just replaced, you were dissolved, erased from collective memory. This was the final cruelty. Not only a silent death, but also a life forgotten right after. In the world of courts, laughter had to always exist, but it was never tied to one person. They wanted the role, not the human being. The cold replacement of the court fool was like changing the batteries in a fake candle. The light kept burning, but no one cared about the old battery drained and discarded. And so, the life of the fool ended not only in death, but in absolute oblivion. Oblivion hidden beneath the laughter of someone else. What remained after many centuries was a symbol full of paradox. The fool no longer existed as a real person, but their image became one of the most familiar symbols of European culture. A symbol that was funny and tragic, ridiculous and profound. Look at the jester's cap with its 3 long floppy tips, each ending with a bell jingling at every movement. It was designed to provoke laughter, to make its wearer look foolish and absurd. But over time, that very cap became tied to the idea of truth spoken through laughter. People later looked at the fool and realized, inside the foolishness was wisdom. Inside the laughter was bitter truth. The paradox was this. A fool was despised their entire life, yet centuries later, they became a symbol of a special kind of intelligence, wisdom hidden inside madness. People mocked fools, but at the same time admitted that fools could say what no one else dared. People laughed when fools fell, but also understood that laughter reflected society's cruelty. In literature, art, and theatre, fools appeared not just as entertainers, but as mirrors. Shakespeare put the fool in many plays, where the seemingly stupid character was the one who spoke the bluntest truths. In King Lear, it was the fool who dared show the king his blindness. And so, the fool, scorned by the entire court, became the voice of reason. The paradoxical symbol was also the duality, laughter and tears. Outwardly, the fool made others laugh. Inwardly, their lives were filled with tears. That paradox made the fool a symbol of the contradictions of human existence. We laugh, but in the laughter there is sorrow. We live, but often life is just a performance. Interestingly, modern society still keeps the fool's image, but in opposite ways. On one hand, fools are symbols of childhood joy, appearing in circuses, street performances, bringing harmless laughter. On the other hand, fools became symbols of fear, of psychological distortion, like the haunting clowns in horror stories. This duality comes directly from history's paradox. Fools were both joyful and suffering. On a deeper philosophical level, the fool was seen as an image of freedom in chains. They were confined, despised, but also the only ones allowed to speak truth, even if only as a joke. They were slaves, but also freer than anyone else, because they could break taboos with laughter. That paradox made the fool a symbol of the blur between power and truth. The lowly sometimes held more power than the noble. Yet this paradox also twisted the fool's legacy. People remembered the fool as an image, but forgot the real humans who once lived, endured humiliation, and died in silence. People honored the fool, but remembered no names. It was a half-honor, both glorifying and erasing, both respecting and forgetting. Perhaps the paradoxical symbol was the only legacy the fool left to history, a collective memory that laughed and cried at once, that revered and scorned, that admired and denied. They were no longer real humans, but mirrors reflecting society's contradictions, where laughter and pain always went hand in hand, where truth and jokes could never be separated. Throughout the tragic journey of the court jester, there was something both bitter and strange. Laughter, the very chain that bound them. was also the only weapon they possessed. If they were forced to live their whole life to provoke laughter, then that very laughter, when used skillfully, could shake the throne itself. On the surface, laughter was a tool of entertainment. It lightened heavy atmospheres, soothed the king's anger, and made banquets livelier. But at a deeper level, laughter could become a dagger hidden in velvet, because the jester could speak truths no one else dared, and the only way to do so was through laughter. Imagine a banquet. While courtiers only praised the king, the jester stepped forward and said, "The subjects sing of victory, but they whisper that the taxes weigh heavier than grindstones." Laughter erupted, the hall shook. The king laughed too, but in his smile was a flicker of suspicion. In that brief moment, truth slipped into the heart of power through the only safe path, laughter. That was the jester's weapon. Not swords, not armies, but the ability to plant truth in others' minds without being branded a traitor instantly. Foolishness on the outside was the armor, and laughter was the arrow. Laughter also had the power to break down class distance. When a noble was mocked by a jester, and the hall roared with laughter, in that moment his power wavered. People saw weakness, foolishness, raw humanity. Laughter stripped away the velvet cloak and revealed the truth that even the most powerful could be made a joke. But at the same time, this weapon was a double-edged sword. If the jester was too clever, too sharp, laughter turned into humiliation. Then, it was no longer tolerated. The king or nobles would see it as a direct attack. And when laughter was seen as an assault, the jester would pay, with whips, with dungeons, even with their life. This was the tragedy. The only weapon was also the noose. The jester had to constantly balance, say enough to be sharp, but not too much to make enemies. Make others laugh, but never let them feel humiliated. One wrong step, and the weapon turned back on them. Yet because they had to live on that tightrope, many jesters became masters of the art of striking with laughter. They knew how to use metaphor, fables, to satirize without being accused outright. They knew how to twist words so the king thought he was teasing someone else, while the whole court understood it was aimed at him. Some stories say that at times, a jester's laughter saved an entire court. When factional tensions ran high, a well-timed joke made everyone laugh, dissolving an atmosphere on the brink of bloodshed. When a king was about to make a reckless decision, a sharp jest made him pause, think again. In those moments, laughter was as powerful as any political advice. But remember, the jester was never credited for it. If the court escaped disaster because of a joke, people called it luck, not wisdom. If a decision changed after satire, credit went to the king, not the jester. The jester's laughter was a weapon, but a weapon stripped of ownership. In history, the image of the fool was preserved precisely because of this paradox. The foolish held dangerous power. Laughter meant to soothe could become a blade. Laughter meant to entertain could topple arrogance. And within that paradox, the jester became both the weakest and the most dangerous figure in court. In the end, laughter, for the jester, was no longer joy, but the weapon they were forced to wield to survive. A weapon no one acknowledged, yet everyone feared. And like every weapon, it could both protect and kill the one who held it. The deeper meaning of the jester's laughter lies in this. It is a constant reminder that power, no matter how great, is fragile. At a lavish banquet, when the king sat on his throne, surrounded by counts, bishops, and knights, with everyone bowing low in praise, only the jester dared to step forward and say something different. Only he dared to turn that grandeur into a joke. And in the moment when the whole hall burst into laughter, the supreme power of the king suddenly wavered. Not wavered in the sense of losing the throne, but wavered in the sense that it was exposed, stripped bare, suddenly something that could be mocked. Imagine a proud king after victory. He wore a cloak embroidered with gold, raising his cup of wine among cheers. And then the jester stepped forward, bowed low. "Your Majesty has won greatly. The horses are tired, the soldiers are hungry, but at least the enemy now knows we have more cloaks than they do." Laughter erupted. In that instant, everyone realized that glorious victory was only on the surface, and beneath it were cracks. That was the fragility of power. It only stands strong when wrapped in splendor. but that splendor can shatter with a single joke. The jester's laughter was like a mirror, forcing the ruler to see that he too could be mocked, that he too could be seen through, that he too was only human. That was why many wise kings kept a jester by their side, not just for amusement, but so there would always be someone reminding them that the throne was not immortal. Yet the paradox was this, the jester reminded, but was never recognized as the teacher of the king. He was only the entertainer, while his true role, the one who reminded power of its fragility, was hidden. Laughter made the king wake up, but when dawn came, no one remembered who had made that happen. The fragility of power was also revealed clearly in the topsy-turvy festivals of the Middle Ages. In them, jesters or commoners were allowed to play the role of king, while the real king sat below as a spectator. These festivals were filled with laughter, mockery, even vulgarity. But their deeper meaning was a warning. The throne could be overturned, and all power was temporary. The jester, in that role, became the representative of the truth that power was a mask, one that could be pulled off at any moment. The bitter truth for the jester was this: the more they made kings realize the fragility of power, the more they were despised, because power never liked being reminded that it was fragile. A king might laugh at a jest, but inside he still felt uneasy. Nobles might clap when one of their own was mocked, but they also feared they would be next. The jester was necessary, but always resented. On a deeper level, the jester reminded the whole society of the impermanence of order. A peasant might be looked down upon, but in laughter, he could laugh at a count. A queen might sit on a throne, but a clever remark could make her blush. The jester's laughter was the whisper that said, "All are human, and power cannot hide its fragility." But, as with every part of the jester's tragedy, the price was their own. Laughter exposed the truth, but that truth was never credited. It was only seen as a joke, and the one who spoke it, the one who held up the mirror to power, was the only one never to be taken seriously. Before the wandering circuses roamed medieval Europe, or the court jesters with jangling caps croaked out laughter beside the throne, the world had already witnessed another cradle of performance, the ancient Greek stage. And if we want to understand why humans have always been obsessed with acting, laughing, crying, and watching others transform on a wooden platform, we must turn back to Athens more than 2,500 years ago. The Greek stage did not come from palaces, nor from petty amusements. It was born out of religious ritual. The Greeks worshipped Dionysos, the god of wine, ecstasy, and revelry. During the Dionysia festivals, people gathered, sang, danced, and gradually those rituals turned into structured performances. At first, it was only the chorus telling the tales of the gods. Then individuals began to step out and dialogue with the group. That was the moment drama was born. The first man credited as the father of theatre was Thespis. He broke away from the chorus and played a character himself. From that, the term thespian was born, and theatre became a place where humans could embody gods, heroes, or villains. Athens turned this into tradition. Every year, tragedies and comedies competed in grand festivals, with officials, philosophers, and soldiers in attendance. What made Greek theatre unique was its scale and social meaning. Open-air theatres, like the theatre of Dionysos at the foot of the Acropolis, could hold tens of thousands. The whole city sat together, from free citizens to famous philosophers. When a tragedy of Aeschylus, Sophocles, or Euripides rang out, it was not just entertainment, but a moral lesson, a philosophy about human fate and the power of the gods. We see in Oedipus Rex by Sophocles, humans struggle but cannot escape destiny. In Medea by Euripides, love twists into hatred, leaving haunting questions about the human heart. These plays didn't just make audiences cry or shiver, they taught them the fragility of human existence. In a way, Greek theatre was a collective philosophy class, but taught through emotion instead of logic. Yet Greece did not only have tragedy. Alongside the dark tales of fate, they had comedy, and Aristophanes was the master. His comedies boldly mocked politics, war, even philosophers of the time. In The Clouds, he turned Socrates into a fool living in the sky, arguing about nonsense that helped no one. In Lysistrata, he had women go on a sex strike to force men to end war. It was laughter as a weapon, direct, daring, yet accepted because it was performed on stage. This shows that the Greeks understood the power of theatre. It was both an offering to the gods and a mirror to society. Tragedy made people bow to fate. Comedy made them laugh at themselves. And this duality made Greek theatre the foundation of all later drama, Roman, medieval, and modern. It's also important to emphasize that Greek theatre was a communal ritual. When all of Athens sat together, they weren't just watching actors. They were participating in a shared experience, laughing, crying, reflecting as one. It bonded society, shaped civic identity, and made art an inseparable part of political life. And here lies a fascinating paradox. Medieval court jesters lived and died in solitude, their names forgotten. But in Athens, actors and playwrights were honoured as cultural heroes. Their names carried on for thousands of years. Both were performers, yet one's laughter was buried, while the other's art became immortal. The birth of Greek theatre, therefore, was not merely the start of entertainment. It was the beginning of humanity using performance to speak with the gods, with society, and with themselves. And in that turning point, human history found a new way to both reflect and free the soul. If the origin of Greek theatre was the ritual offering to Dionysos, then its peak was tragedy. Greek tragedy was not just a sad play, but the place where humans confronted fate, limits, and the greatest question of all. What are we in the game of the gods? Greek tragedy always began with a hero. He was not weak, but often a king, a prince, or a general. Men of greatness, strength, and talent. But precisely because of that greatness, they were prone to hubris, pride, arrogance, daring to challenge destiny itself. And from that moment, the tragedy began. Look at Oedipus by Sophocles, one of the most famous tragedies. Oedipus was the intelligent, brave king who once saved Thebes by solving the riddle of the Sphinx. But in his quest for truth, he discovered he himself had killed his father and married his mother, exactly as the prophecy foretold. Oedipus was great, but powerless, because man cannot escape fate. And so the tragedy was not only Oedipus's pain, but the echo to the audience. No matter how great, we are still small before destiny. Or in Agamemnon by Aeschylus, the victorious king returned after 10 years of war at Troy. But his pride and the blood spilled on the battlefield had sown the seeds of vengeance. His wife Clytemnestra killed him the moment he stepped through the palace gates. Here, the tragedy was not in one act, but in the spiral of blood. Victory, power, hatred, revenge. Humans were trapped in a cruel chain of destiny, where every great deed carried its price. The unique thing about Greek tragedy was that it was not just for tears. It had the function of catharsis, cleansing the soul. When the audience witnessed a character's downfall, they felt fear, phobos, and compassion, Elios. And in the moment of crying and fearing together, the whole community was purified, released. That is why Greek tragedy was not just a play, but a collective spiritual ritual. The audience of Athens did not just entertain themselves. They were learning. They learned that power is not eternal. They learned that pride leads to destruction. They learned that humans must be humble before the gods and before their own limits. In a young democracy like Athens, these lessons were crucial. Tragedy reminded them that even the most powerful cannot escape divine law. Beyond that, Greek tragedy reflected profound moral questions. In Antigone, the princess dared to defy the king's order to bury her brother. The story was not just Antigone's tragedy, but a debate. Which is more important, the law of man or the law of the gods? These plays forced the audience to think, to face questions with no easy answers. Greek tragedy, therefore, was not useless sorrow. It was a mirror, a school, a warning. The audience cried for Oedipus, but in truth, they were crying for themselves, for the fragility of human fate, for the limits no one escapes. Looking from today, we can see clearly, Greek tragedy laid the foundation for all later theatre. Shakespeare was deeply influenced when he created Hamlet, Macbeth, Othello, great figures who fell because of ambition and flaws. Even modern cinema, from epic dramas to superheroes who fail, all carry the breath of Greek tragedy. But what made Greek tragedy immortal was not only the stories, but the power of community. Imagine tens of thousands of Athenians sitting in an open-air theatre, breathing together, crying together, shuddering together. In that moment, they were no longer individuals. but a united body bound by shared pain. And that was the greatest strength of tragedy. It turned suffering into the thread that tied humans together. If Greek tragedy was the stern mirror for humans to face their fate, then Greek comedy was the mocking blade, stabbing straight into vices, flaws, and even power itself. It didn't make the audience cry. It made them laugh. But behind that laughter was a sting, because the target of the mockery was none other than society, politics, and even the very people sitting in the audience. Born from the festivals honoring Dionysos, comedy quickly became an important genre, walking side by side with tragedy. But while tragedy dug deep into the relationship between man and destiny, comedy chose another path, overturning injustices, exposing the stupidity of the powerful, and allowing the community to laugh at the very system that ruled them. The man who left the biggest mark on Greek comedy was Aristophanes. His plays, from The Clouds, The Wasps, to Lysistrata, all shared one thing: relentless satire. He wasn't afraid to drag contemporary figures, philosophers, generals, politicians, onto the stage for ridicule. And the Athenian audience, instead of being offended, delighted in it, because they saw their own voices reflected there. In The Clouds, Aristophanes turned Socrates, the great philosopher, into an old fool floating in the air, lost in useless reasoning that served no society. The play made audiences roar with laughter, but also planted doubt. Was philosophy just nonsense? That was the power of comedy. With laughter alone, it could change how a whole community thought. Or in Lysistrata, Aristophanes went further. He wrote a story of the women of Athens and Sparta staging a sex strike, refusing their husbands' beds to force men to end war. The sight of desperate, ridiculous men had audiences howling with laughter. But behind the joke was a daring political message. War is stupidity, and even women, those thought voiceless, could be a force to stop it. What made Greek comedy unique was its bluntness. It didn't dance around, it didn't disguise, it named names. In a democratic society like Athens, where politics belonged to all citizens, the stage became a public forum, where anyone could be turned into a joke. A greedy general, a corrupt statesman, an arrogant philosopher, all could be dragged onto Aristophanes' stage. This made Greek comedy a tool for keeping power in check. When tens of thousands of people laughed at a powerful figure together, it wasn't just entertainment, it was collective judgment. Laughter, in this sense, carried as much weight as a vote. But comedy didn't only aim upward at rulers, it mocked the daily habits of ordinary people too: superstition, laziness, belligerence. Aristophanes didn't just punch up, he punched sideways and down, making the audience look at themselves. And the miracle was, they weren't angry. They felt liberated, because laughing at themselves was also a cleansing. If tragedy brought catharsis through tears, comedy brought catharsis through laughter. Both served the same purpose, helping the community face the truth, whether through pain or mockery. That's why Greek comedy was never just entertainment. It was a public form of social critique, where injustice, stupidity, and cruelty could all be dragged into the light. And strangely enough, Athens, the birthplace of democracy, not only allowed that laughter, it encouraged it, making it part of political life. Compared to medieval court jesters, the difference was striking. Jesters had to sneak satire in, wielding laughter like a dangerous weapon, always at risk of death for one wrong word. But Greek comedy was public, open, witnessed by the whole city. One was laughter in chains, the other was laughter as a collective weapon. Greek comedy, therefore, was not just the foundation of comedic art. It was proof of the power of laughter as a political social tool. It reminded everyone that when people dared to laugh at power, they were also declaring that true power lay in the hands of the community. Greek theatre was born from religious ritual, with tragedy and comedy carrying deep philosophical meaning. But when it entered the Roman era, everything slowly changed. The Romans were practical. They loved grandeur, noise, and public entertainment. So what had once been sacred ritual in Athens became mass entertainment in Rome. Roman theatre, in that sense, was both a continuation and a distortion. At first, the Romans were directly influenced by the Greeks. They borrowed tragedies and comedies, translated them into Latin, and staged them. But over time, they gave theatre a Roman soul: less philosophy, more action, less reflection on fate, more dramatic twists, humour, and even vulgarity. For the Greeks, theatre was where humans conversed with the gods and philosophy. For the Romans, theatre was where the crowd could have fun, laugh, and forget the hardships of daily life. One of the defining features was the rise of popular comedy. Playwrights like Plautus and Terence elevated Roman comedy, but in a very different direction from Aristophanes. Where Aristophanes openly satirized politics, Plautus and Terence focused on everyday situations. The cunning slave outsmarting his master, the young man pining for the girl next door, the miserly old man getting pranked. The laughter came from irony, witty dialogue, and social role reversals. Roman audiences loved it because it reflected their own lives, not lofty, not distant. But Roman theatre wasn't only about scripts. It was tied to spectacle. The Romans built massive theatres, not just for plays, but for singing, dancing, concerts, and visual displays. In many cases, the stage stopped being about storytelling and became about dazzling with technique and extravagance. They even brought real animals on stage, or staged mock battles to amaze the crowd. Gradually, pure entertainment overshadowed ritual spirit. If in Greece a tragedy made audiences reflect on human fate, in Rome a successful play was one that made the crowd shout, laugh, or applaud loudly. Many works were even cut down, stripping away philosophical depth to suit the masses' tastes. To the Romans, theatre didn't need to be profound. It needed to be clear, funny, and exciting. From there, we see the slide from ritual to spectacle. At first, performances were tied to religious festivals, but eventually, theatre became part of the policy of bread and circuses, a tool for rulers to keep people satisfied. Citizens could be poor, but as long as they had free bread and shows, they would forget suffering and injustice. Art, in this sense, became a political instrument. The irony is that, while more entertainment-driven, Roman theatre spread across Europe more widely than Greek theatre. The Romans built an empire, and they carried theatres and stage culture with them. From Gaul to Britannia, from Hispania to North Africa, Roman theatres rose, giving locals their first taste of plays, jokes, and public performance. And from here, after Rome's fall, the seeds of theatre survived in medieval folk forms. Still, Roman theatre wasn't just cheap fun. In its comedies, you can still see sharp satire against greed, foolishness, and social injustice. Plautus, for example, painted old misers so despicable they became objects of ridicule, or braggarts so absurd they exposed their own stupidity. Roman laughter no longer attacked politics directly like Aristophanes, but it still targeted timeless human flaws. Another hallmark was exaggerated acting. The Romans loved big masks, grand gestures, and voices trained to carry across vast theatres. They didn't look for Greek subtlety of inner conflict, but for clarity, accessibility, and spectacle. That made Roman theatre easier to spread, because you didn't need much philosophical knowledge to enjoy it. Overall, Roman theatre changed the essence of performance art. It turned Greek solemnity into public amusement, turned dialogue with the divine into crowd-pleasing distraction, turned laughter from political weapon into entertainment tool. And in that transformation, we see a turning point. Art was no longer just a philosophical mirror, but part of everyday life, where anyone could come, laugh, and applaud. Roman theatre, therefore, didn't leave us with eternal philosophical truths like Greek tragedy, but it left another legacy, the legacy of popular, mass art that could nourish millions of people with moments of relief from harsh reality. And from that mass appeal, after centuries in darkness, theatre would be reborn in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, carrying both entertainment and intellectual depth. Before the wandering circuses of medieval Europe, or the court jesters with their jingling caps laughed hoarsely beside thrones, the world had already witnessed another cradle of performance, ancient Indian theatre. And if we want to understand why humans are obsessed with acting, laughing, crying, and watching others transform on a wooden stage, we have to turn back to Athens of more than 2,500 years ago. Greek theatre was not born from palaces, nor from little entertainments. It grew out of religious ritual. The Greeks worshipped Dionysos, god of wine, ecstasy, and joy. During the Dionysia festivals, people gathered, sang, danced, and gradually those rituals turned into structured performances. At first it was just a chorus telling the stories of gods. Then individuals split away to dialogue with the group. That moment gave birth to drama. The first man credited as the father of theatre was Thespis. He stepped away from the chorus and became a character himself. From then on, the word thespian was born, and the stage became a place where humans could embody gods, heroes, or even criminals. Athens made it a tradition. Every year, tragedies and comedies were staged in great festivals, attended by officials, philosophers, and soldiers. What was special about Greek theatre was its scale and social meaning. Open-air theatres, like the theatre of Dionysos at the foot of the Acropolis, could hold tens of thousands. The whole city sat together, from free citizens to famous thinkers. When tragedies of Aeschylus, Sophocles, or Euripides were performed, it wasn't just entertainment, but moral lessons, philosophy about fate and divine power. In Sophocles' Oedipus Rex, humans struggle but cannot escape destiny. In Euripides' Medea, love turns into hate, leaving haunting questions about the human heart. These plays did not just make people cry or shiver, but taught them about the fragility of life. In a way, Greek theatre was a public philosophy class taught through emotion instead of logic. But Greece did not only have tragedy. Alongside dark tales of fate, they also had comedy. And Aristophanes was the master. His comedies openly mocked politics, war, even philosophers of the day. In The Clouds, he turned Socrates into a fool floating in the sky, lost in useless arguments. In Lysistrata, he let women go on a sex strike to force men to end war. It was laughter as a weapon, bold, direct, but tolerated because it was on stage. This showed that the Greeks understood theatre's power. It was both worship and a mirror of society. Tragedy made humans bow to fate. Comedy made them laugh at themselves. And together, they built the foundation for all later drama, from Rome to the Middle Ages to modern theatre. It's important to stress that Greek theatre was a communal ritual. When all of Athens sat together, they weren't just watching actors, they were sharing an experience, laughing, crying, thinking together. It bonded society, built civic identity, and made art a vital part of politics. And here lies the paradox. Medieval jesters lived in obscurity, forgotten. But in Athens, playwrights and actors were celebrated as cultural heroes, remembered for thousands of years. Both were performance, but one was buried in shame, the other immortalized. The birth of Greek theatre was not just the start of entertainment. It was humanity finding a way to speak with gods, with society, and with itself. And in that turning point, history found a new way to reflect and free the soul. In India, theatre carried deep spiritual colours with the philosophy of rasa. But in China, drama developed in a different direction. It became a fusion of ritual, folk culture, and political power. And for thousands of years, Chinese drama was not just an art form, but a mirror reflecting society, from glittering palaces to poor villages. The origins of Chinese drama can be traced back to ancient religious rituals and masked dances. People once danced to drive away evil, pray for rain, honor the gods. These performances gradually gained storytelling elements, with characters and dialogue. The real turning point came during the Tang dynasty, 7th–10th century, when Emperor Xuanzong established the Pear Garden Academy in the palace, where artists were formally trained. This is considered the foundation for later Chinese opera, but Chinese drama did not stop at the palace. By the Yuan dynasty, 13th–14th century, Zhaju variety plays exploded, becoming a popular folk form. Works like The Injustice to Do Yi by Guan Hanqing, or The Romance of the Western Chamber by Wang Shifu, were both tragic and comic, entertaining yet critical of society. In Do Yi's Injustice, a woman is wrongly executed, and her cries of grievance stir heaven and earth. The audience not only wept for her personal tragedy, but also saw the injustice of the bureaucracy. From the very beginning, Chinese drama carried the breath of the people and the voice of protest. By the Ming and Qing dynasties, drama flourished even more, culminating in Peking opera. This was a synthesis of singing, dancing, dialogue, martial arts, and especially a highly symbolic system. On the Peking opera stage, a small flag could represent an entire army. A few circles around the stage could signify a journey of hundreds of miles. The audience didn't need realistic sets. They used imagination to complete the theatrical world. What made Peking opera special was body language and painted faces. Performers used 4 basic skills: singing, speaking, nian, acting zuo, and fighting zi to portray characters. Every hand gesture, every step, every glance carried meaning. Painted faces also formed a code: red for loyalty, white for treachery, black for integrity, green for ferocity. Just by seeing the face, the audience knew who the character was, good or evil, loyal or corrupt. Chinese drama, therefore, was both artistic expression and a social language. However, Chinese drama was also tied to political power. Dynasties used theatre to promote Confucian values: loyalty to the ruler, filial piety, respect for ritual. Plays about Guan Yu, Judge Bao, or Mu Lian were not only entertaining but also moral lessons. Meanwhile, voices criticizing society had to hide in allegory, tragedy, or humor. The voice of the people could rise, but always under state control. Interestingly, Chinese drama was both collective and symbolic. People didn't watch plays alone. Whole villages and families came together. Stages were built in squares, temples, audiences ate, chatted, shouted while watching. Drama became part of community life, a shared festival. At the same time, with its symbolic system, every play went beyond the story to touch universal meanings: loyalty and treachery, good and evil, justice and corruption. Compared to Greece and Rome, Chinese drama cared less about tragedy versus comedy in the Western sense, and more about harmony and balance. A single play could contain tragedy, humor, martial arts, singing, all woven together for a full experience. The audience laughed, then cried, clapped for a fight, then fell silent at a lingering song. Drama wasn't about dividing emotions, but embracing them all. More importantly, Chinese drama revealed the link between art and life. It reflected injustice, praised loyalty, mocked corruption, while reminding people of core values from Confucianism, Buddhism, Taoism. On stage, Chinese society was recreated, both as a mirror and as a dream. Compared to Indian theatre, the difference is clear. India aimed for spiritual liberation, while China aimed for social adjustment. On one side, theatre was yoga for the soul. On the other, theatre was a collective moral lesson. Yet both shared one truth. Theatre was never just entertainment, but a way to teach humans how to live in a vast universe. And thanks to that power, Chinese drama has lasted thousands of years, surviving wars, dynasties, upheavals. Even today, Peking opera, Kungfu opera, Huangmei opera still echo on stage, carrying the resonance of the past. It is not just art, but collective memory, the soul of a civilization. We now continue our journey to Japan, where theatre takes on a very special form. At once solemn and meditative like ghosts in the night, yet also vibrant, noisy, and dazzling like a street festival. Japanese theatre is the fusion of two extremes: No, solemn, mysterious, and kabuki, flamboyant, full of vitality. Both carry the spirit of Bushido and the unique worldview of the Japanese people. First, let's talk about No, a classical theatre form born in the 14th century, tied to the names Zeami and Kanami. If Greek theatre had tragedy, China had Peking opera, then Japan had No as a form of spiritual theatre. On the No stage, there is almost no backdrop, just a bare wooden platform with a pine tree painted behind. Actors wear masks, dress in traditional costumes, walk slowly, each movement carefully calculated. No is not meant to tell a dramatic story with fast-paced climaxes. It is like a living painting, where gods, demons, samurai, and the souls of the dead appear to recreate a slice of the universe. The audience does not seek suspense, but meditation. Every glance, every small gesture, every resonant drumbeat can pull them into a state of contemplation. The themes of No usually revolve around death, impermanence, loyalty, and the struggle between duty and emotion. A No play might tell of the ghost of a betrayed woman returning to the world, or of a samurai sacrificing his honor for loyalty to his master. Beneath it all is the spirit of Bushido, absolute loyalty, readiness to face death, and courage within tragedy. If No is the whisper of souls, then Kabuki, born in the early 17th century, is the cheer of the streets. In contrast to No's stillness, kabuki is a visual festival. Bright colors, exaggerated gestures, dramatic plots, the sound of drums and shamisen roaring loud. Kabuki was born from the common people, and from the beginning was aimed at captivating the masses. On the kabuki stage, actors don't wear masks, but paint their faces with kumadori, bold red, blue, white lines, exaggerating character traits, red for courage, blue for evil, white for the supernatural. Movements are no longer slow like No, but strong, dramatic, often stopping in a me pose, a tense stance that makes the audience clap and cheer. Kabuki stories often revolve around love, betrayal, revenge, and the tragedy of the samurai class. But they are not only entertainment. They reflect social conflicts, between honor and emotion, between law and justice, between duty and personal dreams. One of the most famous themes is Chushingura, the tale of the 47 Ronin, avenging their master, a symbol of Bushido. These plays moved audiences because they evoked loyalty and honor, core values of feudal Japan. What makes kabuki special is its boldness. It was once dismissed as lowly entertainment because it was too loud and linked to courtesans, but precisely because of its bond with the common people, it became a cultural symbol recognized worldwide. Kabuki, with its vitality, proved that art does not only live in palaces, but must also echo in the streets. Placing No and kabuki side by side, we see an intriguing paradox. One is meditative like Zen, the other explosive like a festival. But both reflect Bushido, a spirit that values honor, loyalty, and acceptance of death as a natural part of life. In No, Bushido appears in silent sacrifice. In kabuki, it appears in violent vengeance and loyal tragedies. The coexistence of No and kabuki also shows the Japanese view of art. Art is both a path of discipline and a joy of the world. It can bring people into contemplation, but also make crowds cheer. It is the balance between stillness and movement, between meditation and festivity, a balance that has become the soul of Japanese culture. Today, both No and kabuki are recognized by UNESCO as intangible cultural heritage. When a No play resonates with solemn drums, or a kabuki scene bursts with lights and music, it is not only traditional art, but an echo from the past, where the Japanese once lived, fought, and laughed, and cried under the shadow of Bushido. Japanese theatre, with No and kabuki, is therefore not only performance art. It is a mirror of a people, at once meditative and lively, honoring dignity while craving life. And it is this multifaceted nature that has made it one of the most unique theatrical heritages in the world. So, what is the global legacy that ancient theatre left for humanity? First of all, ancient theatre gave us the universal language of expression. From Greece to India, from China to Japan, people all found ways to use the body, the voice, music, and space to tell stories. Even if languages were different, even if religions, philosophies, and customs were different, audiences could still understand pain through a cry, joy through laughter, courage through a strong step, and sorrow through a bowed figure. This laid the foundation for modern theatre, where a play can cross borders to touch the heart of someone on the other side of the world. The second legacy is the connection between art and community. In Athens, the whole city gathered under the Acropolis to watch a tragedy. In Rome, tens of thousands crowded into theatres to laugh at Plautus's plays. In India, theatre was part of religious festivals. In China, villages went together to see opera at the communal temple. In Japan, kabuki pulled thousands of market-goers into packed seats. Ancient theatre was never just a personal pastime, it was a collective experience, where communities laughed, cried, and reflected together. From here, theatre became one of the bridges between art and social life. The third legacy is the reflection of power and morality. Greek tragedy reminded us of the fragility of power. Aristophanes' comedy dared to laugh at politicians. Roman theatre, though commercialized, still pointed at greed and foolishness. Chinese opera praised loyalty and filial piety, but also indirectly exposed corrupt officials. Japanese kabuki revived the tragedy of samurai, where honor and loyalty were greater than life itself. Each theatre tradition, in its own way, became a social mirror, both reinforcing and questioning the values of its time. Another legacy not to be overlooked is the concept of catharsis and rasa. The Greeks taught us that tragedy could cleanse the soul with tears, making us more human. The Indians taught us that theatre could awaken hidden flavors of emotion, helping people find serenity. These two concepts, one from the West, one from the East, became parallel pillars, influencing the entire history of performance art ever since. Not only that, ancient theatre also left behind forms and structures. From the Greek chorus to Chinese masks, from symbolic movements in no to mi poses in kabuki, all are physical languages that modern theatre has absorbed, transformed, and reimagined. Today, in a contemporary play, we still see those traces. An actor walking slowly across a wooden stage like in No, or using masks to embody archetypes like in Peking opera. More importantly, ancient theatre left humanity with a fundamental question: what is art for? Greece answered, to face fate. Rome replied, to entertain and soothe the people. India affirmed, to liberate the soul. China emphasized, to teach morality and maintain order. Japan said, to honor dignity and the beauty of tragedy. And from these answers, modern theatre continues to search for its path, sometimes to resist, sometimes to console, sometimes simply to remind people that they live together in a world full of contradictions. The global legacy of ancient theatre, therefore, is not the specific plays, though they are still performed and studied today. The real legacy is the way people across the world learn to use theatre to tell stories, to laugh, to cry, to reflect, to connect with one another, and to look directly at the fragile essence of life. Today, when modern lights shine on Broadway, when European opera houses resound, when a folk troupe still sets up a makeshift stage in a village courtyard, all are extending that thread from the past. A thread that began with songs to Dionysos, with the pages of the Natya Shastra, with the drums of No, with the red-painted face of Guangong, with the bold stance of a kabuki warrior, and that thread has never been broken. One could say, ancient theatre is humanity's shared heritage, a heritage not locked in a museum, but alive in every laugh, every tear, every story retold across generations. We have journeyed together through a long path, from the roaring cheers in Greek theatres, the satirical laughter at power in Athens, the grandeur of Roman stages, the mysticism of India's Natya Shastra, the symbolic subtlety of Chinese Peking opera, to the solemnity of No and the explosion of kabuki in Japan. Each civilization left behind its mark, its style, its philosophy. But when we look back at the entire road, we can draw one final message. Theatre, wherever and whenever it appears, is always a mirror reflecting the human soul. The first thing to affirm, theatre is not just for entertainment. The Greeks used it to reflect on fate, to learn to accept destiny. The Romans turned it into a tool to soothe the masses, but in doing so, they proved that art can sustain communities through moments of escape from harsh reality. The Indians saw it as a religious rite, a path for the soul to approach the divine. The Chinese made it into a collective moral lesson, both praising loyalty and criticizing injustice. The Japanese made it the place where Bushido lives on, in both silent deaths and fierce displays. In each place, theatre carried a mission that rose above laughter, above tears, a mission tied directly to the question, what does it mean to live? The second message, both laughter and tears are necessary. Greek tragedy taught us that tears can cleanse the soul. Aristophanic comedy taught us that laughter can be a weapon against power. Chinese opera blended tragedy and comedy to remind people that life is never one-toned. Japanese kabuki made us weep for loyal tragedy, then cheer for blazing martial arts scenes. It is the coexistence of laughter and tears that made theatre a place where humanity could experience itself fully. Weakness, strength, cowardice, nobility, all present at once. The third message, art is a collective heritage. No theatre survived for a single individual. It always lived in communities. Athenians crowding outdoors, Romans filling theatres, Chinese villages gathering at temples, Japanese people flocking to markets for kabuki. Communities nourished theatre, and theatre nourished communities in return. It reminds us that, in a divided world, art can be the common ground where everyone shares an experience together, laughing, crying, or sitting in silence before a sacred moment. But perhaps the deepest message of ancient theatre lies here. All power is fragile. In Greek tragedy, mighty kings collapse before destiny. In Athenian comedy, powerful politicians become laughingstocks. In Chinese theatre, corrupt officials are exposed. In kabuki, noble samurai die for honor. Theatre everywhere told us the same unchanging truth. No power is eternal, only humanity remains. Today, even as modern theatre is partly replaced by cinema, television, or social media, that message still holds. No matter how the lights change, no matter how technology evolves, the essence is the same. People still need a place to tell stories, to face themselves, to hear echoes of the past, and to illuminate the present. Theatre, in its broadest sense, still lives in every form of performance art today. So what is the final message? It can be said simply, theatre is humanity. It is the voice of the community, the reflection of power, the place where people learn to laugh at injustice, cry for suffering, and reflect on fate. Whether called tragedy, comedy, opera, Peking, opera, no, or kabuki, all began from one common need, the need to be human, fully, completely, with all its contradictions and beauty. And perhaps, for that very reason, ancient theatre, with all its rich forms, never only belongs to the past. It is a living heritage, still breathing in every story we tell today, in movies, on small screens, or in a simple performance in a village square. That heritage whispers to us, never forget that people need stories, and in every story, we find ourselves. Throughout this journey, which moment impressed you the most? Was it the tear of sorrow, or the satirical laughter? Leave your answer down in the comments. I'm always excited to hear your perspectives. Thank you for staying with me until the very end of this long road. I wish you a peaceful day, full of inspiration and joy, so that no matter where we are, we can continue to tell and listen to the stories of humanity together.